it's a very European, certainly a very Roman thing for me to be sitting down. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'll be giving two presentations this week. Basically, my two presentations are going to focus on my current research on the genetics and the ethics of gene editing. By training, I am a molecular biologist. I received my PhD in biology at MIT in Boston, where I was actually involved in some of the first studies on the genetics of aging. So it's really striking that Father Joseph ended his presentation with a short discussion of aging. It is a work that I spent 5 years of my life doing, and my students, even my students today, we are beginning some initial studies to go back into the field of genetics of aging. But this afternoon, I would like to talk to you about this distinction, therapy and enhancement. Now, Father Joseph used the book Beyond Therapy, which you can see on the left here, Beyond Therapy, and he used that book to give you an overview of the current debates over genetic engineering and human enhancement. I would like to focus on one particular distinction, and that is the distinction between therapy and enhancement. And you can see that on the left side, you have a book, Beyond Therapy, and on the right, you have Truly Human Enhancement. And these are two incredibly good books for you to read to understand the two sides of the current debate over human enhancement. On the left, Beyond Therapy, the text is thought to express a conservative, traditional account of the ethics of human enhancement. And on the right, you have Nicholas Agar's text, Truly Human Enhancement, which is a progressive, liberal, and yet somewhat restrained account of human enhancement. So when my students are thinking about this, we usually begin with both these texts. You can compare and contrast them. I'd like to point out that I am a Catholic priest, and so I am going to speak first as a Catholic moral theologian, a Catholic bioethicist, but also bring into account some of the secular responses to the Church's position on this distinction. So this is the therapy and enhancement distinction. And within the Catholic Church, so if you wanted to understand the Catholic Church's most recent position, most recent document on bioethics, then you should look up Dignitas Personae, which you can Google online. And this is paragraph 26 of Dignitas Personae. And in Dignitas Personae, in paragraph 26, in section 26, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is reflecting on the moral boundaries for genetic engineering. And what I would like to point out is that the Catholic Church, too, uses the distinction between therapy and enhancement. So here you have one way of talking about therapy. Therapeutic purposes restore the patient, or they restore the normal genetic configuration of the patient, or to counter damage caused by genetic anomalies or those related to other pathologies. So you get a sense that therapy restores the normal. And if you go later to the very end of that paragraph, the Church will then talk about other purposes other than medical treatment. And here we have hints of enhancement, particularly improving and strengthening the gene pool. And so on Wednesday, when I come back in the morning to speak about CRISPR, which is the most current and the most groundbreaking technology that we have available to us to genetically engineer a human genome, any genome, we're going to keep this in mind. The Church is teaching on the distinction between therapy and enhancement. However, this morning, what I would like to do is I'd like to push this distinction, because I don't think that this distinction is as robust as we think it may be. And so this is the question we're going to be dealing with today. Is the distinction between therapy and enhancement robust, strong enough? Now, I know a couple of you, how many of you were here for my presentation on Friday? Because I can recognize a couple of people. So this will be I will be a repeat of a couple of things that I said on Friday, but we're going to spend more time on this discussion. So we're going to deal with three things this afternoon. The very first is I would like to talk about the philosophical background to the distinction and why some people, especially secular individuals, struggle with the distinction between therapy and enhancement. I would then like to focus on the distinction in practice, and here I would like to talk about what we are doing today when we do pharmacological interventions with the human being, focused especially on the lowering of bad cholesterol or LDL. Do we today observe the therapy enhancement distinction? And I'd like to propose that we do not. And in fact, no one has a moral problem with that. And finally, I would like to discuss what I think is a better distinction than the therapy and enhancement distinction. It should be, I think, a therapeutic versus a non-therapeutic, therapy versus non-therapy, rather than therapy versus enhancement. So I'd like to begin by just focusing on the distinction itself. So what is the difference between therapy and enhancement? Now, a lot of people, a lot of secular people, in fact, have pointed out that it is often very difficult to make this distinction clear. So I'll give you an example. This is Julian Savulescu in a book on human enhancement. Now, Savulescu is a proponent not only for human enhancement, but some would say extreme human enhancement involving transhumanist aspirations. So if you notice here, he will talk about enhancement in the following way. Enhancement is indeed a wide concept. In the broadest sense, it means increase or improvement. So everyone acknowledges that enhancement means to make something better. But then you notice his example. His example is therapy. For example, a doctor may enhance his patient's chance of survival by giving the patient a drug. And so what he is trying to do is he's trying to blur the difference between therapy and enhancement by saying that therapy, the therapy of taking an aspirin, for example, or for having surgery to remove an appendix, that this in fact is enhancement because it enhances your chance of survival. And so you have an attempt here to blur the difference between therapy and enhancement. I'm going to contrast Savulescu's account with an account by Michael Sandel. So Michael Sandel is a philosopher at Harvard University, and he was in fact, I believe, a member of the Bioethics Commission, the President's Bioethics Commission, that came up with the report Beyond Therapy that Father Joseph summarized just a few minutes ago. And he will make this account. Enhancement employs medical means for non-medical ends. And so what he's going to make a distinction here is the distinction between medicine and non-medicine. And he's going to point out that non-medicine means things unrelated to curing or preventing disease or repairing injury. Now, I would like to see what you think. I'm an American, so when I lecture, I always ask questions. And so I would like to, so here, is cosmetic surgery therapy or enhancement? So let me just ask, what do you think? Yes? Could you stand up, please? And just louder, and then I'm going to try to communicate your question. Yes?
Cosmetic surgery could be therapy or enhancement.
So your view is there. Now, there are people who will contrast cosmetic surgery with plastic surgery. Right? So they will say that plastic surgery is surgery to correct a defect or correct a problem, but cosmetic surgery is there primarily to make you look more beautiful. So how many of you think that cosmetic surgery is therapy? And when do you think it would be?
Therapy. For instance, if you have sarcopenia, which is a genetic disease that makes your muscle to amplify. If I have this disease, then it's therapy. But if I am a normal person without this genetic disease, and I have this kind of therapy, then it will be enhancement because I will be stronger.
So the example you give is that if there's a genetic disease and the therapy is, the surgery is meant to correct the genetic disease, then it is therapy. But if I am a healthy individual, then it is in fact enhancement. Okay, so and the same therapy, depending on the person, will be either therapy, the same medical intervention, depending on the particular person. It could even be the same person, but at different times in life. Maybe therapy or enhancement, depending upon the situation. And what's striking, I think, is you bring up the concept of health. And so we need to talk about health. Because as you see, a lot of people will make the distinction that therapy involves unhealthy people and enhancement involves healthy people. And it's interesting that I don't know if many people are opposed to cosmetic surgery. Say, for example, if you want to have a facelift, so your face is pushed back so you look pretty when you are 65. Is that therapy or is that enhancement, number one? And second, if therapy is good and enhancement is not good, well, that's the myogenin. That is the myogenin mutation yes. And so we will talk about that on Wednesday when we talk about genetic engineering. So you have a situation here where we have cosmetic surgery. What is interesting is, as a priest, I have individuals who come to me and say, Father, I want to get Botox. And they say, is it good or is it not good? So we're not even talking about genes. We're talking about Botox. And I do not want to ask if anyone here uses Botox, because but I'm going to ask, right? See, we're talking about we're talking about ethics. Is it good or is it not good to use Botox to remove or to strengthen out, to paralyze the muscles of your face so you look younger? Right? This is the question, because if we're talking about therapy or enhancement and we're talking ethics, people will talk about gene therapy, we will talk, but I'd like to talk about Botox. I would like to talk about Olay. Olay is the Rejuvenis cream, is a cream that you can place on my students. Last month I had to learn so much about facial cream because I was in a class involving facial cream. And so I read Marie Claire magazine for the first time in my life. And I did not realize how many different cosmetic products you can buy that is mucho expensive. So, you have, for 1 ounce, it goes from $14.99, which is Rejuvenis, the lowest quality, to $100 per ounce of a serum to put on your face. Now, is that therapy or is that enhancement? I mean, these are the questions. We worry about ethics, but I want to talk about your face.
I think that there is a very thin difference between therapy and enhancement if we consider the psychological effects that those therapy or enhancement have of the people that are using or prefer to use that products or surgical
interventions. So what you see already, so what is your name, please?
Giovanni.
So Giovanni says the following thing. He says, the line between therapy and enhancement is thin. And it's important to see that the context of the intervention will be important in deciding whether or not we can say yes to it. I would also point out that I think the difference between a cream and surgery is that a cream is thought to be reversible. I can put it on today, it's for a short period of time, but tomorrow, if I don't do it, it will come back. But for the surgery, surgeries are more long-lasting and permanent. But I want you to see how the ethics of what we think about can be applied to ordinary circumstances, things we do every day to help us understand it better. So what I'd like to point out is that, as we have seen, the distinction between therapy and enhancement presupposes that we understand what is health and disease. And is it healthy to have wrinkles on your face? You see, so if you have wrinkles, does that mean you are not healthy? Does it mean that you have a disease? Is it a disease to have wrinkles on your face? What does that mean? So we will now talk a few minutes about health, just to try to understand what you think health is about. So let's talk about this. This is Michael Bess. He's a philosopher, a bioethicist. In 2010, he wrote the following. The treatment enhancement distinction changes because it depends upon what we mean by health. And the meaning of health changes, he will say, from culture to culture and time to time. And so this is where a lot of people will say that health is radically subjective. There is no such thing as an objective standard for health. What is healthy in Italy may not be healthy in America. It may not be healthy in Manila, in the Philippines, where I was born. And what you think is disease in Italy may be different from what disease is in America versus in Africa. How many of you think this way? That the account of health very much depends upon the culture of the human patient. How many of you think it has nothing to do with environment and with culture? It depends only upon the patient. No one sure. No one sure. All right. Now let me point out, for example. Now that the Catholic Church pretty much assumes that there is a standard of human physiology that constitutes health.
There are also the guidelines, international guidelines for a lot of disease, and I think that there is the things are combined, are linked.
So, and your name, please? Ivana says, look, there are international guidelines to what constitutes disease. And there are guidelines. Now, what I'm going to propose to you, that health is both objective and subjective. They come together, and it comes together in ways that they're not relative. And I'm going to point out this. What blood levels of hemoglobin are healthy? Very simple question, right? Very simple question. What is a healthy level of hemoglobin? And a lot of people will say, I can look up the books, and the books will tell me that hemoglobin has to be from here to here. But it depends actually, because different populations of people have different levels of hemoglobin. So this is a figure that I pulled from a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So what you see here is that you have 3 male populations. So this is Ethiopian, living at 30 meters in Ethiopia. In the United States, this is my home area, sea level. Then people who live in Tibet, 4 kilometers up. And then people who live in the Andes, also 4 kilometers up. And what is interesting is that the Andes, the male from the Andes, have a significantly higher hemoglobin content than anyone else, even those who live in Ethiopia and even those who live in Tibet. So what's very striking is what is healthy for a person living in the Andes is going to be different from what is healthy for someone living in Roma. Because if you know this, because if you flew to the Andes, you went to Peru, you will be susceptible to what is called altitude sickness. So altitude sickness is that your hemoglobin levels that are healthy here are not healthy when you go to the Andes. It will take you several weeks for your physiology to adjust so that it will be able to, you will then recover your health. And people will say, I'm not feeling good, I'm throwing up, I'm not, even though your body is healthy for Rome, by flying to Machu Picchu, your body, what constitutes health here changes because you are now in a different environment. And so what I want to point out is that those individuals who say that health is relative, in one sense, are true. Because health is a relationship between your body and the environment. And so there are going to be, what constitutes health in Rome, healthy in Rome, may not be healthy in the Andes. It's really striking that when you have marathons, the best marathoners are people usually from East Africa. And that is thought to be because of their physiology. Their physiology, which is adapted to that environment when running a marathon in London or New York, puts them at an advantage over those who have lived their whole lives in New York or in London. Now it's interesting because Father Joseph in his talk talked about doping. And if you know what doping is to take your blood and to concentrate your blood, and then just before the race, inject your blood back into you. So you notice, we're using your blood. There is nothing physiologically, we have not altered your blood. We have simply returned your blood to you. And yet we would consider that immoral for the reason that Father Joseph pointed out. It is cheating. However, if you decided to go to Machu Picchu and spend 3 months in Machu Picchu training for your race, then you would actually increase your blood count. And in fact, end up in the same place that you would end up with doping, but that you would do this in a way that we say engages the virtue of the human person. Because you ran in Machu Picchu. You moved to Machu Picchu. So I would like to point out that you see it's a little, the distinction between doping and training in Denver or in Machu Picchu. There are a lot of people who are asking, what is the difference? Because in principle, it's the same thing. what, as Father Joseph pointed out, though, what is different is the human person's involvement in that change. It takes, you actually had to run in order to develop the high levels of hemoglobin. You didn't just have to inject them into yourself. So I'd like to point out that health appears to be environment dependent. Now here's another thing. Is it also technology dependent? So I'd like to raise this. This is Father William Stempsey. He's a Jesuit at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, not very far from my city. He said, if health is a goal of medicine, it is not a static goal. It is not an unchanging goal. And he will point out, because technology will force us to change what it means to be healthy. It's a very interesting question. And I do not have an answer for this right now. I just want to throw that question out for you in order for you to consider it. Will technology change what we consider to be healthy, such that without the technology, you would be considered non-healthy? Or is health something to do primarily with your body and your body alone? So for example, glasses. So we talk about technology, we think technology is expensive. Glasses are technology. So how has technology changed the way that we imagine correcting eyesight? Is LASIK is a different intervention from wearing glasses? If so, why is that so? I would just throw these questions out. So what I would like to do now is to move to an example where I think that therapy and enhancement, a medical example today that reveals that the therapy and enhancement distinction is one that we have already crossed. And what I would like to talk about here is LDL. So LDL is bad cholesterol. HDL is good cholesterol. And so we know that high levels of LDL are associated with high levels of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke. So if you look at the average LDL level amongst US adults, age 20 to 74, the number is 119 milligrams per deciliter. So the normal range is about 90 to 130. So there are international guidelines written by usually Westerners, and so they will say that the normal range is 90 to 130 milligrams per deciliter. But if you go to Africa, or if you go to Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, and you look at the hunter-gatherer tribes, these are people who live in the jungle, who eat basically the produce that they can catch that day. There is nothing artificially made in what they eat. The typical HDL levels is about 70 milligrams per deciliter. And if you look at monkeys, 30 to 50 milligrams per deciliter. And there is one human being who has been found with a mutation in one gene called PCSK9. And we will talk about PCSK9 at the end of my lecture. And his LDL levels are 15 milligrams per deciliter, and he is very healthy. So now the question is the following. What should the target levels be? If you know that the normal range is 70 to 130, and the average is about 120, what should we do? Now, if you want to talk about therapy and you want to say we have to focus on therapy, and therapy is returning to the norm, the species norm, then we should target 70 to 130. Anything outside of that would not be therapy. Because this is what healthy is. for Americans 24 to 70 living in 2018. But studies have shown that the lower the LDL levels, the better you are in preventing yourself from getting sick. So can we make you healthier than healthy? This is the question, and this is where enhancement comes in. Because even today, the international guidelines will suggest that we should go as low as possible. So if you look at, these are the international guidelines, if you look at the recommended target LDL levels, they will say that for those patients who are healthy but have high risk of disease, so if your parents have a heart disease but you do not have heart disease, and you are considered healthy today, we should lower your LDL levels below 70 to enhance, you see, this is where it hangs, to enhance your health. So it is less likely that you will get sick from cardiovascular disease, even though today you are healthy. And so this is already standard of care today. And so what we are saying is that today, society has no moral problems with using drugs to push the human body beyond the norm associated with our species. Now, this is the PCSK9 revolution in cholesterol therapy. So until recently, if you had high levels of cholesterol, you would take statins. Today, we are moving to PCSK9 inhibition. I pointed out that we found one human being who has a mutation in PCSK9, and this individual, I do not know if he's male or if she's female, but this individual has very, very, very low levels of LDL and is very healthy. And so what we have now, this is just to give you a sense of the biology. So here's PCSK9. This is the LDL receptor of a liver cell. A receptor is the molecule that tells the cell that LDL, the bad cholesterol, is present. And when PCSK9 binds to the LDL receptor is destroyed. And so what we are doing now is that we have drugs. You have two drugs here, Praluent and Repatha. These are two monoclonal antibodies that prevent PCSK9 from working. And what you have now is you lower the levels of LDL because more LDL is absorbed by the liver. And so the patients are healthy. And so what you have a situation now is you have a PCSK9 inhibitor. And this is thought to be better than statins. And today I was reading a paper. Cardiologists would like to combine PCSK9 inhibitors and statins to lower your LDL levels even more than we can do today. So now, given this example, what I like to do is to propose that what's more important in talking about enhancement technology and genetic engineering is not therapy versus enhancement, because there are therapeutic enhancements that are good. LDL reducing drugs and LDL reducing medical interventions, but it should be between therapy and non-therapy. Now, as you see, it's important, therefore, to define therapy. If we're going to talk about therapy and non-therapy, we have to define therapy. And for me, one of the most helpful ways of looking at this is to begin with a definition of disease, first proposed by Marshall Marinker in 1975. And he makes a distinction between disease, illness, and sickness. And so often in the English language, those three are interchangeable. But what he wants to do is he wants to make to distinguish each one of these. So he says unhealth, there are three different modes of unhealth. First is disease. This is the pathological, biological process. This is, and he will say this is a deviation from a biological norm. So you can have, so he will say this is a deviation from a biological norm. But for it to be disease, what happens is it is also an experience of unhealthiness. So the human being will say, I feel not healthy. This is called illness. So first you have a deviation from the norm. Then the human being physiologically feels unwell. And then he calls the third mode of unhealth sickness, where sickness is the subjective interrelational dynamic of healthcare. Yes. So sickness is, sickness, as I'll read it here, is a social role. Sickness is what happens when you have to interact with other people. And other people will say, how do you feel? And you say, I am sick. So there's one level where you're dealing with the biology. The second is with the subjective experience of that biology as being unwell. And then the third is what happens when that individual interacts with others in his society. I'm exploring this model to try to come up with an account of therapy. Because you see, there is a deviation from the norm. For example, if you lower LDL levels, it is not experienced as feeling unwell. Because you feel better. Because you will survive better, you will be able to resist or delay cardiovascular disease. And so in order for something to be a disease properly so called, there is the objective physiological change from the norm, and then there has to be a subjective experience of being unwell. And that these two together define disease. And that therapy is correcting this. So someone who has a mutation that deviates from the norm but does not feel unwell is not disease, even though he or she may be outside the norm. Okay, so what I'm proposing, and this is a tentative proposal, this is something I'm still thinking through and writing through, is that in order for us to properly talk about therapy, we need to properly talk about disease. And in order to properly talk about disease, you have to have two components. One is a physiological objective component where there is a deviation from a norm. And this depends upon where you are. If you live in Ethiopia, if you live in Machu Picchu, if you live in New York, there's going to be some difference. But at the same time, I would like to propose there is a subjective element and a subjective element where you experience this variation from the norm as feeling unwell. I have to add that there is a third component, which is the social component, for the following reason. I have had a student struggling with anorexia. Anorexia is where there are body image issues, and in this case, a woman student stopped eating. And her body weight is physiologically beyond the norm for her age and for her body shape. But she does not experience herself as unwell. she experiences herself as healthy. And this is where the social component is also present. So it cannot be simply, I feel bad, and so there has to be a relational component, which is why I point out that Marinker's account where sickness, where the social dimension of illness is also important. And so you have three different components coming together. There's a biological norm. There is an individual subjective experience, but there is also a social perspective that is both subjective and objective. And that disease is defined with a dynamic of these three. And therapy is meant primarily to prevent that. So here you have therapy cures, prevents, or delays disease to prevent illness and sickness. So this is a tentative proposal that I'm still thinking through. And with regards to non-therapy, especially with genetic engineering, especially with non-therapy seeks to increase personal or social opportunity. I'm focusing here on opportunity. Because if someone wants to be taller, if someone wants to be more intelligent, and someone wants to be more beautiful, often, not always, but often he or she is choosing this because that individual thinks that that medical intervention will lead to more opportunity, either personal opportunity or social opportunity. Now, one of the things that if you notice I have not yet thought about is cosmetic surgery to make you feel better. So you want to look more beautiful. Is that non-therapy? How would that increase personal or social opportunity? Is it simply a matter, I want to look beautiful? I think some people will have it, but I also think I want to look beautiful because if I look beautiful, then I can get something. I can get a better job, or someone will love me. And so what you see here is it is still linked in some way to opportunity. So this is how I am trying to distinguish therapy from non-therapy by focusing on a model of disease that is tripartite, and then for non-therapy, trying to focus on opportunity. Notice again, it is not as black and white as you would want to. You could imagine someone who wants to get better in order to get a job. But I still think that getting better in itself makes it therapy, even though he may be choosing it to get a better job. Now, when we talk about CRISPR on Wednesday, genetic engineering, what I'm now proposing, and I proposed this in an article in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, is that if therapeutic enhancements like statin use to lower LDL levels are good, then we should consider that genetic immunizations may also be good. And these are two examples. There are many more. CCR5 delta 32 makes a human being immune against AIDS. So a lot of people who are descended from, who are ethnically Irish, is anyone here of Irish background? So if you're Irish background, the likelihood you carry a CCR5 delta 32 mutation is higher than it would be for me. And if you have a CCR5 delta 32 mutation, you cannot get AIDS. You can get HIV, you can carry HIV, but you will never die from it because the virus is not able to cause disease in you. So you are healthy even though you are HIV positive. Now it's really interesting because it would suggest that CCR5 delta 32 and patients, individuals with CCR5 delta 32 are actually very healthy. And I think it's very important I relate a story to you. So the only known cure for a person with HIV/AIDS is a young man, I think he was in Germany, who became HIV positive. At the same time, he developed leukemia. And people thought, oh my goodness, two bad things. You must be so unlucky. But his doctor was incredibly smart. His doctor gave him a bone marrow transplant from a patient who had CCR5 delta 32. And so the last thing is the patient who was HIV positive, who also had leukemia, received a bone marrow transplant to cure him of his leukemia. But at the same time, the doctor, being smart, picked a donor for the bone marrow who was also CCR5 delta 32. And the patient recovered from leukemia, and he was cured of AIDS because his entire immune system was rebooted, and the HIV could not infect the new cells that were CCR5 delta 32. And if this is the case, can we use genetic engineering to genetically engineer bone marrow so that patients with HIV/AIDS would be cured and immunized from that disease? Now, in this case, two extra copies of P53. So one of the things you may not know is that elephants, it's very difficult for elephants to get cancer. Very difficult. And one of the reasons why it is very difficult is they have 20 copies of this gene, P53. P53 is called the guardian of the genome, and it protects your genes against the mutations that cause cancer. You and I have 2 copies. Elephants have 40. 20 from mom and 20 from dad. We have 1 from mom and 1 from dad, which is why it's very difficult for them to get cancer. Would it be possible to genetically immunize a patient by increasing the number of P53 genes in stem cells, in this patient's stem cells, so the patient doesn't get cancer? Again, this is therapeutic enhancement. And in terms of genetics, and this is CRISPR, so this is my lead up to my talk on Wednesday. This is a paper describing using CRISPR to change the gene PCSK9. Remember, PCSK9 is important for regulating the levels of LDL in your blood. We have now been able to make a mouse, a rat or a mouse, I'm not sure which one it was, that is genetically depleted of PCSK9 and so has 30% of normal levels of LDL. And so again, if we can do this to human cells, would that be something that we could do? Now, Father Joseph at the end of his talk talked about aging, and in fact, when I entered the Dominican order, I had 3 patents on this research, and when I made solemn vows, I gave the patents to the order, like I gave everything else to the order. And so the Dominicans now have owned 3 patents on technologies involving aging. And the question is the following: is aging research therapy or enhancement? And I would like to suggest it depends on the research. Because if the research is such that it actually delays, it prevents disease. So for example, I can make your heart pump better, or I can prevent the cells in your brain from dying, and you therefore live longer, that can become understood to be therapy. If, however, I change the basic metabolism of your body to slow down the aging clock, that may be considered enhancement. And I think this is still where a lot of people are thinking through the difference between therapy or enhancement. So I'm going to end my lecture here. So I have acknowledgements, but I will delay my acknowledgements to Wednesday, since I have to give another talk on Wednesday morning on CRISPR. So we have 5 more minutes, and I'd like to know if you have any questions. I know there was a question at the back. Any questions? Can we use this to... So... I'm trying to see if we could just pass this.
Does it work?
It's working.
See.
I don't know if it's...
See.
Much easier with a microphone.
How many questions can I make?
Why don't you start with the first one?
No, because I would choose if I
maybe,
can only few.
Well, you can
I
start
have
with...
at least 4.
Okay, let's start with 2.
Let's start with 2. Okay. Then I will skip this one. Okay. You didn't talk as technology changes. Also, the average health changes, and more therapy goes towards personalized medicine. So all this talk about averages, it's not so important anymore, because it will be more individual. So even health and enhancement has to be viewed in the view of singular individual.
Yes, I think for my laboratory, my research laboratory, I'm a cancer biologist. So my students and I are looking for new drugs to inhibit one particular gene, with the idea that if men who have prostate cancer because of this one gene, they will receive this one drug. And so different cancer patients will have different cocktails of drugs depending upon the genes that are turning on and driving their tumors. However, if you go to Mass General Hospital, for example, in Boston, which is a hospital that is at the forefront of personalized medicine, if you go into the personalized medicine clinic, you still see a technological process that is needed to personalize that medicine. So you're correct that the outcome is personalized, but the technology that is in place is a singular technology that can be used for different people. So the same thing with genetic engineering, right? So genetic engineering will become personalized, but genetic engineering, the technology itself, is still general. And so we can talk about the ethics of the technology, and then we can talk about how this technology applied to this person could be ethical or not ethical. So there's 2 kinds of questions.
Second question, if I only may make 2. The prevention was always part of the medicine. So why do you think it's enhancement now?
I'm sorry, the first?
The prevention was always part of the medicine. Why do you think it's enhancement now?
No, I actually agree with you that the prevention of disease is therapy, right? It can be therapeutically enhancement because it is preventing disease. It is preventing disease by pushing the boundaries of what is the norm for our species. So there's a difference between I'm telling you don't eat too much carbonara, that is prevention, and then I'm going to change your genes so that the LDL levels drop. that is also therapy, but it's now therapeutic enhancement. So there's therapy by itself and therapeutic enhancement depending upon how we are trying to prevent the disease. But then I'm also saying there's non-therapeutic enhancement, which is involving changing people to enhance personal or social opportunity. Thank you for your questions. Any other questions? Yes, in the front.
I have one question on the example you said about wearing glasses. I would like to know what is the difference from a bioethical point of view between wearing glasses, intraocular lens with surgery, or
LASIK.
vision, to have a better sight.
Yeah.
Because it has a genetic trait.
So we will talk about on Wednesday. So the question, did you all hear the question? Okay. So the question that the participant asked was the following. What is the ethical difference between wearing glasses, using intraocular surgery to replace a lens, or genetically modifying the retina in order to enhance sight? So I think what we will see is that the ethical differences are going to rest not on the fact that we are improving sight, but the other questions that are going to arise, which we will discuss on Wednesday, are things like the following. How permanent is it? It becomes more morally serious if the change is permanent and irreversible. If I put the wrong lens on your glasses, it's not a problem. You can bring the lenses back and I change your glasses. If you put an intraocular lens and it's the wrong lens, you will sue me because it's very difficult for me to change that. But if you genetically engineer your retina, it is even more difficult. So I think the ethics are not going to differ based on what you are doing, but how you are doing it and the long-term and possible irreversibility of the interventions. And the same thing is true today, even with regards to, making yourself look good. Makeup versus Botox versus surgery. People will talk about there are different ethical questions raised by those three interventions.
The second question is about the dim line
The line?
therapy, or what is normal and not. What do you think about this case of those two women I think it was in Maryland, but there's a hospital that they were deaf, and they had a child that was deaf.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Okay, so there's a question. 20 years ago, two lesbian women chose to conceive a son who was deaf. The lesbian women were themselves deaf, and they wanted to conceive a son who was deaf. And the way they did that is they chose the sperm from a man whose family had several generations of inherited deafness. And when their child was conceived, I believe he was profoundly deaf in the left and partially hearing on the right. And the question is, it generated enormous amount of debate, because what they wanted to argue is that deafness is not a disease, deafness is not unhealthy, it is just a different way of being a human being. And being normal. It's another normal way of being a human being. And what I do when I teach this in class is I go on YouTube, and you can show on YouTube a blind child who is hearing his voice for the first time. Or there's a girl who's a deaf child who is hearing his voice for the first time, or his mother's voice for the first time, or there is a YouTube video of a deaf girl who hears a Beethoven symphony for the first time. because they receive cochlear implants. What do they do? Do you know, have you ever seen these videos? What happens when they hear this for the first time? They cry. They cry, I mean, unbelievably cry. And so I tell my students, why are they crying? Are they sad? And my students say, no, they're so happy. And I go, why are they happy? And they're happy, they'll say, the students say, they found out that they lacked something that was so beautiful. And I say, so I say, if it was something that was beautiful that they lacked, that they cry with joy when they discover it, this would suggest that it is a very good thing for the human person to have, and that for the human person to lack it is a privation. It is something that is inherently lacking. I tell my students this: to be deaf does not mean that you are any less or more of a human being because of our intrinsic human dignity. But to be deaf is a kind of human being who has less of what a human being could have. And that is important to see. And so that's why I would say it would be therapeutic to correct. And in fact, we're having a debate because now in the United States, the deaf community would like to ban cochlear implants for deaf children. Because they will say that to put the movement to provide cochlear implants is cultural genocide. It is the eradication and destruction of the deaf culture and the deaf society. Now, at the end of his talk, Father Joseph pointed out that all of these debates revolve around a proper understanding of human nature. Not just human nature now, but human nature as it is supposed to develop and to become excellent. And how human nature is supposed to fulfill, as a Christian I can say this, what God has intended for us. And when we lose that, and the secular culture is beginning to lose that, then nature is what you choose it to be. And this is where the debate, we are struggling in our society because we do not know even what we are. You know, when John Paul II, the great Pope and Saint of God, when he became Pope, he made his whole pontificate about human dignity. I think today we are struggling with something even more foundational. We are struggling with human identity. It's not that we do not understand how much we are worth. We do not even know what we are. And that is this is in the last 30 years, we have gone from human dignity, we now have disputes about human identity. We are not sure what the human being is. Great now. Thank you so much for your kind attention.